He despised them, the breed, the haunting memories, and the searing pain they ignited. So when the retired Marine stumbled upon 3 German Shepherd puppies shivering beside their lifeless mother, amid a merciless blizzard he turned away, leaving them to their fate. Yet one small pup refused to surrender, dragging her frozen, fragile body through the snow, resting her head gently on his boot, a silent, desperate cry that threatened to break down every wall he had built around his heart. That night no eyes witnessed the tears that slipped quietly away. None could imagine a soul so hardened could ever ignite with warmth again. But what unfolded inside that cabin will move you deeply and restore your faith in the strength of second chances. Before we dive in, share with me where are you watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no soul should ever be left out in the cold, hit that subscribe button, because this story might just rekindle your belief in miracles. The winter sky above the Great Smoky Mountains was not just gray. It was the bruised hue of battered iron, heavy and low, pressing down relentlessly on the rugged peaks of Tennessee. The air tasted metallic, that eerie kind before a silence so profound it feels like the entire world holds its breath. In the distance, the town of Gatlinburg was likely already bustling with tourists retreating to their warm hotels and locals securing their homes. But up here on the remote ridge where Silas Vance had carved out his sanctuary, only the wind lingered patient and unyielding. Silas stood on his porch, a mug of black coffee cooling in his grasp, a man hewn from the very granite of these mountains. At 58 years old, he bore the rugged, solid frame of a retired U.S. Marine, though a slight stiffness to his posture betrayed the scars of battles that refused to fade. His weathered face, etched with deep lines and furrows, told stories of endless sun and restless nights. His silver regulation short military haircut stood stark against the biting cold, his expression stoic but worn. Clad in a faded, full USMC M81 woodland camouflage uniform, softened by years of wear, yet pressed meticulously with unwavering discipline. Inside the cabin, the sharp ring of the telephone broke the stillness, a sudden piercing scream slicing through the silence. Silas didn't stir immediately. He gazed at the first snowflakes drifting down, lazy and deceiving, the ringing relentless. At last, with a heavy sigh resonating deep within, he turned and wove his way inside, lifting the receiver. "Vance Silas, oh thank heavens you answered." The voice was Clara's. The nearest neighbor, though. Near was a relative term in the Smokies. Clara was a widow in her 70s, a woman whose kindness bloomed persistently, like summer's kudu vines. "Silas, honey, have you seen the forecast? They're warning of a historic blizzard. The radio says power lines will snap like dry twigs. Do you have enough wood? Need me to send the boy with supplies?" Before the roads freeze shut, Silas glanced around his cabin, sparse, tidy, precise. "I'm all right, Clara. You're always all right, you stubborn old mule," she teased, though her voice trembled with true concern. "But this isn't just any snow. It's a whiteout. You shouldn't be out there alone. You could come down here. I made a pot roast. I told you I'm fine." His voice was gravel grinding on stone. "Silas, please. Nobody should face this alone. Alone." The word echoed, reverberating through the walls of the life he had meticulously built. He didn't crave pot roast or the chatter of visitors. What he yearned for was the profound stillness. He longed for the world to cease demanding what he no longer had the strength to offer. "Farewell, Clara," he whispered. "Silas, wait." The call wasn't ended. Instead, his weathered, scarred hand reached to the wall socket, gripping the cord tight and yanking it free. The plastic connector snapped sharply like a final release. Silence swallowed the line. With calm precision, he coiled the wire and placed the phone back gently on its cradle. Isolation was now absolute. By nightfall, the illusion of gentle snowflakes had faded. Outside, the wind screamed like a banshee, crashing fiercely against the cabin's aged timber walls. The mercury plunged, transforming the world beyond into a merciless, frozen wasteland. Silas settled into his armchair, a single lamp casting a soft glow, lost in a book he had read countless times before. The hearth's fire crackled desperately, struggling against the cold drafts sneaking through the floorboards. Then came a sound that defied the storm's fury. It wasn't the wind. It was a faint, piercing, rhythmic wail. Silas closed his book instincts, honed by decades on the battlefield, snapping into focus. He strained his ears. There it was again, a tormenting cry, a living voice of distress calling from the woods at the edge of his property. Coyotes, he murmured, or a bobcat. Whatever the creature it was, wounded. And a wounded predator was a threat. Rising slowly, his knees groaned in protest. He reached for the rifle on the gun rack by the door. With seamless expertise, he checked the chamber. Grasping a heavy-duty flashlight and his thick gloves, he opened the door. A brutal gust slammed into him, trying to hurl him back inside. Snow whipped horizontally, a blinding white veil. Silas bowed his head and pressed onward, his boots sinking deep into the growing drifts. The plaintive sound pulled him forward, now weaker, erratic, nearly swallowed by the storm's roar. He swung the flashlight's beam in sweeping arcs, cutting a cone of honeyed light through the swirling blizzard. He reached the tree line where pines stood like frozen sentinels. The beam illuminated something out of place. A soggy, collapsing cardboard box half buried in the snow. It looked like refuse tossed from a truck long before the storm descended. But the sound came from within that box. Silas moved cautiously, rifle cradled beneath his arm, and shone the light straight into the opening, breath catching hard in his chest. Inside, half out of the ruined box, lay a female German shepherd. Her body was stiff, fur tangled with ice. Death had claimed her hours ago, but pressed tight to her cold side. Huddled in a trembling, desperate heap were 3 tiny puppies. They could only be about 4 weeks old. Their eyes were open, but glazed with terror and cold's icy grip. One was sable, the hue of burnt sand. Another black as the darkest night. The last gleamed white, shining like the snow around them. Silas stared down at the helpless trio, nausea washing over him. German shepherds. Their presence ignited a brutal flood of memories, dust heat, the bitter scent of cordite, and the agonized cry of a dog who was once his other half, his soul bleeding out in endless sand. He loathed them, not because of who they were, but for what they represented. They were weapons, not companions. They were reminders of all he had lost. He despised them, for each glimpse felt like peeling back the scab on a wound that refused to heal. "No," he murmured, but the wind stole the word away before it could escape. "No," he stepped back. This wasn't his burden. Nature was merciless. This was just another harsh truth of it. If he turned away, the cold would claim them in minutes. Quiet, final, done. He pivoted from the box, determined to return to his warm fire and the shelter of silence. Then a sound stopped him cold. Not a desperate cry this time, just a faint, wet, dragging noise. Silas froze. Flashlight beam swung back. The white puppy, the smallest, had pulled itself free from the heap. It struggled forward, its back legs too weak to support it, dragging its belly through the biting snow, leaving a fragile, heartbreaking trail behind. It wasn't inching toward its fallen mother. It was crawling toward him. Each agonizingly slow movement shook its little body so fiercely, its teeth clattered. It reached Silas's heavy combat boot. Too weak to climb, it rested its damp, shivering head against the leather eyes closing. A silent plea of total surrender. No sound needed, help me. Silas looked down at the fragile life fading against his boot. Then, at the other 2 inside the box, breath shallow, barely alive. His marine discipline snapped sharply to attention. The code carved deep over 30 years roared louder than the storm. You don't abandon the defenseless. You don't leave a mission behind. Damn it! Silas' shouted, voice rough and breaking. God damn it. He slung the rifle over his shoulder, collapsing to his knees in the frozen snow, ignoring the biting ice as he scooped up the white pup, feeling how shatteringly cold it was, like clutching a sack of ice water. He pressed it inside his camo jacket close to his chest, then reached into the box, pulling the sable and the black one. Limp barely clinging to consciousness, he shoved them in with their sibling, zipping the jacket halfway to trap their fragile warmth. "Hold on," he growled to the shaking bundles nestled against his ribs. "You don't die on my watch." Rising, the weight pressed heavy against his heart, he turned back toward the cabin. The wind howled, trying to knock him down, but Silas Vance dipped his head and marched on a fortress, unwavering once more. Though this time the gates were just slightly ajar. The heavy oak door slammed shut, slicing the savage white fury outside from the quiet sanctuary inside. The sudden hush was piercing, broken only by the fierce crackle of the fire and the ragged rhythm of Silas's own breath. He stood still, snow melting and dripping on the floor, the strange living weight pressed inside his jacket against his chest. He felt faint, squirming, tiny, fragile moves against his ribs. The sensation made his skin crawl, not with disgust, but a haunting familiarity. It was responsibility's ghost, one he thought he'd laid to rest 5 years ago. "All right," he grunted, the raw sound echoing in the empty room. "Evacuation complete. Now we triage." He strode to the hearth, the blaze's heat slapping his frozen face like a fierce blow. He unzipped his jacket, hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline surge. He pulled out the 3 trembling bundles of fur. No cradling, no cooing. He treated them with the steady, efficient care of a soldier. With the focused precision of a bomb disposal expert, he carefully placed them onto the thick, braided rug before the fire. They were pitiful creatures, wet, trembling bundles that barely resembled dogs. The sable one, the biggest of them all, emitted a sharp, high-pitched squeal that grated on Silas's frayed nerves. The black one stayed silent, curled tightly into a ball. The white runt, the one he'd rescued first from the snow, simply collapsed to the side, panting weakly. Silas stepped back, putting space between himself and the fragile lives. He needed supplies. He needed a plan. He moved toward the kitchen, his limp worsening as the cold seeped into old wounds. He dug through his emergency medical kit, a metal box heavy with the sharp scent of iodine and rubbing alcohol. He found a plastic syringe, the type doctors use to flush wounds, then headed to the pantry. He grabbed a can of evaporated milk and a bottle of water makeshift rations, he muttered under his breath. Before returning to the living room, he stopped by the hooks near the back door and pulled down a pair of thick leather work gloves. He slid them on, flexing his fingers until the tough leather creaked a suit of armor against the vulnerability. If he was going to do this, he wouldn't touch them directly. No skin contact, no warmth except what was vital to keep them alive. He was a medic treating fragile patients, not a man saving companions. He returned to the rug. The fire's heat had dried their fur tips, leaving them tangled and wild. "Feeding time," Silas said grimly. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, awkward with bulky gloves, he mixed the milk and warm water in a small bowl, drew the mixture into the syringe, then reached for the sable puppy. It resisted fiercely the raw instinct to fight. The pup smelled the milk, but recoiled at the cold plastic tip, thrashing wildly, its tiny claws scratching harmlessly against the leather armor. "Hold still, soldier," Silas commanded, gripping its scruff tightly. He forced a few drops into its mouth. The puppy sputtered, then swallowed. Recognition dawned, and it began eagerly suckling at the syringe's tip. Next came the black one. It did not resist. It accepted the syringe with an unsettling calm that troubled Silas. It drank steadily, then scrambled back toward the warmth every movement calculated energy conserved. Then came the white pup. Silas reached for it with cautious, glove-clad hands. It hung limp. When he lifted its head, its neck folded like a fragile strand of overcooked pasta. He pressed the syringe to its muzzle, releasing a droplet of milk. The liquid sat glistening on its lip, untouched. "Come on," Silas growled softly. "Drink." Nothing. He tried once more, tilting the head back, gently massaging its throat through the thick leather. The pup coughed, a weak, wet sound, and swallowed barely a drop. It took 20 minutes to coax even 1 ounce into that frail body. By the time he finished, sweat beaded his forehead, and his jaw ached from clenching so hard. He placed them all in a laundry basket lined with an old wool blanket, setting it near the hearth, but not too close. "Lights out," he whispered. "Don't make me regret this." He retreated to his bedroom. The door left ajar, a tactical mistake, he scolded himself silently. Yet he needed to listen for the fire's life. He lay on his narrow bed staring at the shifting shadows on the ceiling. Outside, the wind had turned into a wild, ferocious howl, slamming against the cabin as if trying to rip it from its roots. Sleep finally claimed him, but it offered no relief. Instead, it delivered the relentless desert. The scorching heat felt like a weight crushing the air from his lungs. Sand invaded every crevice, grit in his teeth, stinging his eyes, even in the jagged wound of the man screaming beside him. Yet Silas's gaze wasn't on the man, it was fixed on the dog. Max. 100 pounds of pure muscle and unwavering loyalty lying motionless in the dust. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths. The vest was torn, stained with too much red. The helicopter was closing in. The thumping of the rotors filled the world, drowning out everything else. Silas fumbled to pack the wound, his hands slick with blood. Max stared back at him, not with fear, but with confusion. "Why can't I rise, boss? Why have we stopped?" Silas called out for the medic, but he was the only one who could help. He was the one with hands powerless to stem the bleeding. The helicopter touched down, whipping up a blinding storm of sand. They pulled Silas away, but his fingers stretched out, brushing Max's fur one last time. The dog lifted his head weakly. The light in those deep brown eyes flickered and then faded. Max. Silas shot upright, a strangled cry tearing through the silence. Darkness surrounded him. The air was biting cold. The fire must have died down. His heart pounded against his ribs like a frantic captive. The echo of rotors pulsed relentlessly in his ears. Cold sweat drenched him. He sat there gasping as the desert began to blur, and the mountain cabin slowly came back into focus. Outside, the wind had shifted to a low, mournful wail. Then reality cut through the nightmare's fog. Silence, the puppies quiet, not a peep. Silas threw off the covers and swung his legs over the bed's edge. The floorboards were icy beneath his feet. Clutching his flashlight, he limped quickly toward the living room. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The cabin now chilled to bone-deep cold. He shone his light into the laundry basket. The sable and black puppies were curled tightly at the blanket's center, a single shared source of warmth. They shivered, but they were alive. Yet Lumina, the white pup, had been pushed to the edge of the group. Whether pushed aside by her siblings seeking warmth or weakened on her own, she lay apart. Silas reached in. No gloves this time. She wasn't just cool, she was cold. He gently lifted her out, stiff and barely breathing. He had to press his ear to her snout to catch the faint hiss of air. Her gums, when he peeled back her lip, were a dull gray. "No," Silas whispered. "No, you won't. I didn't drag you from the snow only to let you freeze here in my cabin." Hurrying to the fireplace, he tossed a log on the coals, blowing until flames reached upward, but it wasn't enough. The frigid air was too harsh, and her core temperature had plummeted too far. A blanket alone wouldn't save her. She had no heat left to trap. She needed something to warm her from the outside. She needed a radiator of warmth. Silas stared down at the fragile life trembling in his scarred, large hand. His gaze shifted to the leather gloves resting on the table, the armor he'd vowed never to shed. He muttered a soft curse that felt more like a prayer. He set the pup briefly on the sofa. He peeled off his flannel shirt, then his thermal undershirt. Standing bare-chested in the chilled room, the cold air bit at his skin, raising goosebumps instantly. He scooped up the pup, sat back down in the armchair, leaning back slightly, pressing the fragile white body directly against his bare chest, nestled close to his heart. He reached behind the chair for the thick woolen throw and draped it gently over them both, tucking it tightly beneath his chin and wrapping it around their sides, crafting a warm cocoon of shared breath. "Come on," he murmured into the shadowed night. "Fight." He lay still, eyes fixed on the firelight that flickered on the wooden beams above. The puppy rested like cold stone on his chest, heavy and unyielding. He waited, anchoring himself in the rhythm of his own breath, deepening each inhale and exhale, summoning every ounce of warmth his weary body could deliver. 5 minutes slipped by in silence. Nothing stirred. Then a twitch. Silas held his breath tightly. Against his skin, a tiny nose nudged, seeking the warmest spot beneath his ribs. Then came a hesitant kick of a leg. The rigidness began to fade, replaced by a softness that slowly melted into him. And then he felt it. Thump, 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 thump. Delicate, quick, fragile. A heartbeat. Pressed right against his own skin, sharing space with none but him, Silas closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the sensation. For 5 long years, his chest had been a hollow chamber filled with regret and fury. He had built walls of silence and isolation around it, but now this tiny, steady beat was knocking at the gates of his fortress. It was not the strong, commanding pulse of a canine warrior. It was the frantic, determined rhythm of a life that refused to surrender. The puppy exhaled a heavy, shuddering sigh, a pure sound of peace sinking deeper into the curve of his arm. Silas lifted a hand under the blanket. Slowly, with careful hesitance, he rested his palm on the puppy's back. The fur was impossibly soft. He didn't pull away. He didn't reach for his gloves. He simply held her. One solitary tear, warm and unbidden, traced down the maze of wrinkles on Silas's cheek before vanishing into the coarse strands of his beard. "Copy that, little one," he whispered into the quiet night. "I've got you. Your signal's strong." Outside, the blizzard raged fiercely, swallowing the world in white. But beneath the blanket's shelter, the ice began to thaw. Time in the Smoky Mountains never flowed straight. It moved in messy cycles of mud and noise. The silent white of winter had melted away, replaced by Tennessee's fierce green burst of spring. Creeks ran high and wild. The air was thick with the scent of wet loam and fresh pine resin. Inside Silas Vance's cabin, once a bastion of military precision chaos had taken hold. 3 months had slipped since the blizzard. The shivering little fur bundles, small enough to fit in a laundry basket, were gone. Instead, 3 4-month-old German shepherds ruled the roost now. Long-legged and awkward, oversized paws, floppy ears struggling to stand tall, and razor-sharp teeth eager to shred anything in sight. Silas had nicknamed them the Insurgents. Standing in his kitchen doorway with a mug of coffee in hand, he surveyed the morning's carnage. It was barely 6 in the morning, but the enemy had already launched assault. Ragnar, the sable male, was locked in a brutal tug-of-war with a braided rug, his growl fierce enough to scare, if it weren't just a rug. He was the biggest of the 3, already bearing the broad chest and confident stride of a dominant leader. His coat was a blaze of tan and black, like scorched earth beneath stormy skies. Lumina, the white female, was his partner in crime. She chased Ragnar relentlessly, nipping at his heels with a sharp, high-pitched bark. She had blossomed into a leggy, spirited beauty. Her once pure white coat was now perpetually stained with red clay, like a ghost forever marked by dirt and time. And then there was Onyx. The black male sat perched on the windowsill, his amber eyes quietly observing the chaos, with a wisdom far beyond his puppy features. He didn't join in the wild destruction, nor did he try to halt it. He was the Watcher, the unit's own intelligence officer. "Disengage," Silas ordered, his voice cutting through the noise with the command of a seasoned sergeant major. Ragnar ignored the command. Instead, he shook the rug violently, tearing a seam. Silas approached, his boots thudding with determination. I said, "Disengage." He seized the edge of the rug. Ragnar glanced up, eyes shining with playful defiance, then jerked back. For a heartbeat, man and dog locked eyes, an unspoken duel of wills. Silas tugged harder. Ragnar released, tumbling backward into Lumina, creating a heap of yelps and tangled limbs. "You 3?" Silas muttered, rubbing his weary temples, "are a walking violation of every rule in the book." He had tried to instill order, created a schedule. Lights out at 7, PT at 8, naps at noon. But these puppies were unstoppable forces of nature. Formation was a foreign concept to them. All they knew was that wooden baseboards scratched their aching gums just right, and Silas's socks were the ultimate prize. The breaking point came late that afternoon. Silas had stepped into the shed to sharpen his chainsaw chain, leaving the trio inside alone for 20 minutes. When he returned, the silence was unsettling. Silence more often than not spelled catastrophe for something precious. He entered the living room and froze. His grandmother's oak dining chair, a heavy hand-carved heirloom that had survived the Great Depression, and 3 moves lay toppled. One leg was splintered beyond recognition, as if a beaver had made the room its home. Ragnar lay among the sawdust, happily gnawing on a chunk of wood. Ragnar Silas roared. The puppy scrambled up, dropping the wood more shocked than remorseful. Silas stormed closer, his anger burning hot in his chest. That's not food. That's not a toy. He bent down to clear the mess, aiming to toss it into the fire. As his hand swept through a pile of wood chips beneath the table, his fingers brushed something cold and metallic. He paused, pulling out the object. A chain with 2 rectangular metal tags swinging at its end, his dog tags. The air left the room in that moment. He kept those tags in the lowest drawer of the sideboard, a drawer usually stuck tight. Ragnar must have clawed it open in his relentless bid for destruction. The tags were slick with saliva. One bore a deep dent where a puppy tooth had sunk in, bending the metal right over his blood type. Silas stared at the dent, realizing it was more than just metal. That tag was the sole remnant he'd brought back from the sandbox, untouched by dirt. It was his identity, the weight of his service, the memory of brothers who never made it home, the symbol of a life where discipline was the key to survival. And now it lay covered in drool, chewed up like trash. Something inside Silas shattered. 3 months of carefully hoarded patience evaporated in an instant. "Enough," he whispered, voice trembling with emotion, then louder, demanding, "Enough." The puppies flinched. Even Onyx, who'd been resting by the door, sprang to his feet. "You're not family," Silas shouted, veins bulging in his neck. "You're nothing but unruly beasts, wild, reckless parasites." He gripped Ragnar roughly by the scruff of his neck, harsher than intended, dragging the bewildered dog toward the back door. He returned for Lumina, then Onyx. "Out. Every one of you out." He forced them onto the back porch, gesturing toward the old woodshed about 30 yards from the house. It was dry, lined with straw, and safely distant from him. Go to the shed now. Confused by his fury, the puppies tucked their tails and scurried toward the shelter. Silas watched as they vanished into the shadowed entry of the shed. He slammed the door shut, locking it. He pulled the curtains closed. Tomorrow, he whispered to the empty room, wiping the dog slobber off his tags with his sleeve. "Tomorrow I call Clara. Tomorrow they have to go. I'm through." Night fell, unveiling a classic Appalachian spring storm. Thunder rumbled down the valley like distant artillery rattling the window panes. Rain poured in relentless sheets, pounding the cabin's tin roof. Silas lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The cabin was quiet. At last it was still. No skittering claws, no soft whines, no gnawing noises. This was the peace he had longed for, yet it felt wrong. That silence weighed heavy on his spirit, suffocating. He rolled over. He punched his pillow, closed his eyes, but the image of the battered dog tag kept flashing in his mind. Then the vision of the puppies fleeing toward the shed, their tails tucked low. "They're dogs," Silas reminded himself. "They have fur. They're safe in the shed." A sharp crack of thunder shook the floorboards instantly, followed by a brilliance of lightning that lit the room like a flare. Silas groaned and sat up. "Just checking the perimeter," he lied inwardly, making sure the door hadn't blown wide open. He rose and walked to the living room window, overlooking the backyard. He paused, hand hovering on the curtain, expecting only rain before the dark silhouette of the shed, where the dogs surely huddled in straw. He drew the curtain back. Lightning flashed again, bathing the yard in harsh blue-white bursts. Silas's breath caught. The dogs were not in the shed. 3 soaked shapes sat on the drenched grass right outside his window, less than 5 feet from the glass. Their fur clung tightly to their thin adolescent frames. They trembled violently in the downpour, utterly soaked to the bone. Yet they weren't staring toward the shed. They weren't struggling to find shelter. They sat arranged in a protective triangle, facing outward away from the house. Ragnar held the center head lifted high, relentlessly scanning the shadowed tree line. Lumina stood on his left, Onyx on his right. They were guarding him. A sharp ache pierced Silas's chest, sudden and heavy. He had cast them out. He had shouted at them. He had turned his back on them. And still here they were, sitting through a thunderstorm, shielding his flank. They might not grasp why he was angry, but they understood that he remained inside. The danger was outside, and their duty was to stand firm between the two. As the lightning faded, leaving only the porch light to dimly pierce the darkness, Onyx turned his head. He glanced back toward Silas standing there at the window. The black dog rose slowly. He approached the glass calmly, no scratching, no whining for entry. He simply lifted one rain-soaked, mud-streaked paw and gently placed it against the pane directly where Silas's hand rested on the other side. His amber eyes were wide, filled with unwavering loyalty and an unspoken plea. His heart wasn't weighed down by anger, but gripped by a deep, harrowing fear. "Are you safe in there, boss?" The question lingered between them, louder than the roaring thunder. Silas's eyes fell on the battered dog tag resting silently on the table behind him. Then he shifted his gaze to the living, breathing emblem of unwavering loyalty trembling beneath the relentless rain. In that moment he understood the metal tag was just a relic. It carried memories of steadfast devotion long past. But this, to feel it now alive, this was true loyalty in the here and now. "I'm the fool," Silas whispered. "I'm the one lacking discipline." He fumbled with the lock, yanking the back door wide open. "Get inside," he shouted, voice breaking through the rainfall. "Move, move, move!" The 3 dogs scrambled into the shelter, shaking droplets everywhere, carrying the scent of damp earth and ozone indoors, mingling with the clean air of the house. They didn't rush toward the fire, they came straight to him. Ragnar, the furniture-wrecking force, pushed his sodden muzzle against Silas's thigh. Lumina gently licked the rain from his hand. Onyx nestled up against his shin, a sturdy, grounding presence. Silas sank to his knees on the waterlogged floor, disregarding the mud darkening his clothes. He pulled them close, burying his face in their soaked fur. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the squad's drenched coats, the same crew he'd nearly charged with mutiny. "We stand our ground. We stand as one." The chair lay broken. The dog tag bore its dents. The floor was a chaotic mess. But as the storm howled outside, Silas Vance grasped a profound truth after 5 long years. His fortress was no longer empty. It was alive with loyalty, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Summer swept over the great Smoky Mountains, not as a gentle breeze, but as a thick, sultry breath, wrapping the air in a heavy embrace. The vivid greens of spring darkened into June's deep, waxy foliage, accompanied by the relentless drone of cicadas singing from dawn till dusk. For Silas Vance, summer marked the end of the fragile truce he'd extended to the unruly band. The phase of chewing destruction was fading, replaced by a lanky, awkward adolescent's paws too large for their bodies. Energy bursting like wildfire. It was time for boot camp. Silas had no patience for softness. No treat pouch jingled at his side. No high-pitched praise escaped his lips. He believed in sharp clarity, binary commands, and the unyielding chain of command. "Squad fall in?" Silas stood tall in the clearing behind the cabin, a flat stretch of grass edged by dense woodland. Dressed in a faded green t-shirt and cargo pants, arms crossed, eyes hidden behind aviators, he was ready. 3 6-month-old German shepherds bounded from the porch, no longer fluffy bundles, They were lean, gangly, and muscular teenaged athletes still growing into their frames. Ragnar reached him first, sliding to a stop, tail wagging fiercely enough to sting a shin. The sable male weighed in at 60 pounds of pure, eager energy. He didn't just want to work, he burned for it. Onyx followed, silently trotting with a graceful, fluid motion. The black male settled on Silas's left, eyes like molten amber scanning the woods before locking onto Silas's face. He wasn't just waiting for a cue. He was reading his leader's every intention. Lumina came last. The white female moved with careful precision, placing her paws lightly before sitting on Silas's right, leaning in just enough against his leg. She wasn't slacking off. She was the steadfast rear guard, the unbreakable bond holding the formation tight. Silas commanded a word sharp and sudden as the crack of a whip. 3 tails thumped down on the grass without hesitation. "Hold," Silas commanded, turning his back and striding confidently towards the tree line. This was the toughest order for creatures born to chase and sprint. He felt Ragnar's restless urge to bolt, burning like fire against his spine. 10 paces, then 20. Silas stopped and spun around. Ragnar was quivering, muscles tensed like a coiled spring, mouth parted in a daring grin that begged just one chance to run. Onyx remained statuesque, carved from shadows like black obsidian. Lumina's eyes traced a drifting butterfly, though she held her ground firmly. "Ragnar, stay focused," Silas murmured low and steady. Ragnar's ears flicked sharply. He gave a sharp, restrained whine of pure energy, yet held his place. "Good," Silas whispered approvingly. For the next hour, Silas drilled them relentless with recalls, heal commands, and emergency halts. This was no show dog training. He was preparing them for patrol duty, silent signals like a raised fist, meaning stop a flat palm commanding down. It was during these drills their unique spirits sharpened, transforming into something Silas recognized from his past in the Corps. Ragnar was their frontline assault, fearless, teetering on reckless abandon. Point to a bramble patch, and Ragnar would charge through without a blink. Brave, yes, but wisdom was not his armor. Onyx played recon quicker to learn eyes catching details Silas might miss. A hawk cutting circles a mile off, a subtle change in the breeze. He didn't follow orders mindlessly. He weighed them, agreed silently, then acted with precision. Lumina, the corpsman. Her focus wasn't the target, but the team itself. If Ragnar stumbled, she was close to sniff him up. If Silas wiped his brow, her nose was right there, nudging his hand. She was the heart, the moral compass keeping the fire of the others steady. "Break," Silas called out, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Drink up." The dogs broke ranks, their soldierly discipline melting into playful pups as they rushed the water bowl on the porch. Silas watched quietly, satisfaction blooming inside. They were listening. They had become a force united. A week later, humidity soared, coating the air in a thick heat that shimmered above the gravel driveway. Silas set his sights on the fallen oak at the property's edge. It had toppled during winter storms, and now needed splitting to fuel the fire next winter. He grabbed his splitting maul heavy, a brutal beast of a tool, with a head weighing 8 pounds, and made his way to the woodpile. The dogs followed behind, settling under the shade of a giant hemlock some 20 yards off, chewing lazily on sticks. Silas slipped into the rhythm of his labor. Thwack, crack, heave the clash of metal against wood echoed through the mountain valley. It was a violent, mesmerizing cadence that cleared his mind. His eyes traced the wood's grain shoulders swinging with force, sweat dripping from his brow. His work was loud, unrelenting. Yet he missed the faint snap of a twig behind him. The wind shifted, blowing from the cabin to the forest, carrying Silas's scent away from the silent intruder. It was a black bear, but none of the wary, garbage-scavenging nuisances tourists snapped with their cameras. This was a full-grown boar, lean, irritable, after a harsh hibernation, and a scarce spring of food. Nearly 300 pounds of taut muscle laced with fierce attitude. The smell of leftover bacon grease from Silas's breakfast trash had drawn him from the forest depths, staking his claim on this territory with bold menace. The bear stood about 30 feet away as the wind shifted. Onks rose first, silent but alert. His hackles, those bristling hairs along his back, stood tall like a battle mohawk. A low, rumbling growl escaped him, vibrating through the air like the slow grind of tectonic plates underground. Mid-swing, Silas froze. That growl was unmistakable, the highest alert in a dog's language. He lowered his maul axe and pivoted. The bear lingered at the edge of the clearing, swaying its heavy head low, tasting the wind. It saw the dogs and the man, yet it didn't flinch. Instead, it emitted a hollow chuff, like popping wood, then stepped forward deliberately. "Hey!" Silas shouted, flailing his arms wide to appear larger. "Move away, get gone." Black bears usually turn tail, but not this one. It pinned its ears back, jaws hanging open in an aggressive huff, unyielding and grounded. "Squad back up," Silas barked, reaching for his maul axe's handle. But the order never made an impact. Ragnar recognized the danger. The young puppy saw the looming dark figure charging toward Silas. Weight or size meant nothing to him. He didn't calculate risk. His only thought was that the invader was too close. "Ragnar, no!" Silas screamed. But it was too late. The sable blur burst from the shadows, covering the 20 yards in heart-pounding seconds, barking a fierce, booming war cry too great for his young frame. No hesitation, no distraction. He lunged straight at the bear's legs, snapping his jaws with fearless resolve. The bear recoiled, stunned by such boldness. It reared back, bellowing a roar that shook leaves loose from the tallest trees. Charged by raw adrenaline and undying loyalty, Ragnar leapt up, aiming for the bear's shoulder. A costly mistake. The bear unleashed a colossal front paw, swift and deadly, like a bolt of lightning's backhand. The powerful blow struck the side of Ragnar's head and shoulder with a sickening, heavy thud that echoed through the forest. The puppy was flung off his feet, tossed through the air like a rag doll, crashing 10 feet away. He rolled twice and lay motionless, for Silas froze. He stared at the still, sable silhouette. The bear turned back its gaze to him, emboldened by its easy win. The icy barrier around Silas's heart shattered and vanished wholly. The Marine's calm precision dissolved. In its place stood a father gripped by the agony of watching his child fall. A red haze clouded his vision. Fear fled, caution evaporated. Only a blazing primal fury burned inside him. "You son of a—" The ferocious scream ripped from Silas's soul, raw and terrifying. A man stripped of all restraint. He didn't run to the cabin for a weapon. Instead, he gripped the splitting maul's handle tightly, knuckles white. Then he charged forward, closing fast on the 300-pound beast, the 8-pound steel hammer raised high above. His face twisted into a demon snarl, his voice a relentless, shattered roar. The bear used to prey, showing fear or submission, froze in confusion. Predators don't confront one another with this kind of ferocious madness. This naked ape was barreling right at him. Silas closed the gap with one thought: "I will end you." He swung relentlessly, not to kill but to wound. The blunt, heavy mallet head crashed into the bear's shoulder with the force of a falling oak. The beast howled in pain and disbelief, staggering backward. But Silas didn't relent. He stepped forward boldly. Raising the axe once more, Silas screamed a torrent of guttural sounds, no longer words but pure, raw anguish. Behind him, Onyx and Lumina barked frantically, flanking the bear, snapping fiercely at the air, feeding the violent symphony surrounding them. The bear locked eyes with the deranged man, sensing the sharp agony tearing at its shoulder, and decided the battle wasn't worth the price. It spun around and bolted into the thick brush, smashing through the undergrowth in desperate flight from the furious hunter. Silas stood there, chest heaving, his breath surging like a storm axe raised high, ready to hunt that beast straight into the fires of damnation. "Come back!" he roared into the empty woods. "Come back!" A heavy silence swallowed the clearing, ringing relentlessly in his ears. Then slicing through the fury came a soft whimper. The crimson haze lifted. Silas let the axe fall, the dull thud echoing his shattered spirit. "Ragnar!" he gasped, racing to the trembling form in the grass. The pup struggled to lift his head, movements clumsy, eyes flickering with daze. Silas dropped to his knees, heartbreaking. His usually rough hands hovered cautiously over the wounded dog, terrified to touch, afraid of what pain might reveal. "Stay with me, buddy. Stay down," Silas murmured, voice trembling with raw emotion. Lumina was already at his side. She licked Ragnar's face gently, whining low, cleansing the dirt from his weary muzzle. Onyx stood sentinel, back to the group gaze fixed on the dark woods, daring any beast foolish enough to return. Silas pressed his hands over Ragnar's ribs. He checked the gums, soft pink, good capillary refile. He studied the eyes. Pupils responded faintly to light. Ragnar blinked. His gaze met Silas's. A weak groan escaped him, tail thumping once against the grass. He was alive. Though concussed, bruised to hell, and maybe nursing a cracked rib he hadn't been torn apart. The bear had swatted him, not shredded him. Silas hoisted the 60-pound dog into his arms. Ragnar whimpered, but nestled his head against Silas's shoulder. "I've got you." Silas choked out tears mingling with sweat on his battered face. "I've got you, son." He carried him back to the cabin, Lumina and Onyx pressing close to his legs, silent guardians. He laid Ragnar on the forbidden sofa, the one place no dog was allowed. But Silas didn't care. He fetched ice packs, gently checking every inch of Ragnar's battered body. Later that night, Ragnar rested fitfully, numbed by a mild painkiller, carefully measured from Silas's medkit. Silas sat on the floor beside the couch, hand resting lightly on the dog's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall. He glanced down. His hand still trembled. He had faced enemy fire-crossed minefields, but never had terror so pure gripped him, like when he saw that bear's claw swing. He looked at the trio, Ragnar, the fallen warrior, Onyx, the ever-watchful guardian at the threshold, and Lumina curled tight to Ragnar's back, shielding him from the cold. For months he'd convinced himself this was just training, a disciplined squad taught to be effective, kept safe. He told himself they were assets, kept at arm's length. But when the enemy breached his defenses today, he didn't act like a handler protecting tools. He reacted like a father defending his own blood. "You're not weapons," Silas whispered to the sleeping dog. "You're not replacements." He leaned back against the sofa, exhaustion weighing heavy on his bones. "You're my family," he uttered into the shadows. "And God help anyone who dares come after you again." Pain wasn't something Silas Vance heard. It was a color, a blinding electric white, that flashed behind his eyes, snuffing out the blazing summer sun. It struck on a Tuesday beneath the suffocating sticky heat of mid-July. Inside the barn, Silas had been struggling to lift a sack of grain that had shifted beneath a leaking roof beam. It was a simple chore, one he'd done 1,000 times before. But he was 58 now, and those damaged L4 and L5 vertebrae, crushed long ago in a Humvee wreck near Fallujah, decided today was the day they'd had enough. There came a sickening pop, then a spasm so fierce it forced him down to his knees in the dirt. Silas bit back a scream, the sound slipping out in a hiss. He tried to rise, but his legs refused to obey. His lower back muscles had stiffened into a relentless knot of torment, squeezing his sciatic nerve. The world spun. Nausea crashed over him. The cabin was just 50 yards away. It took him 45 agonizing minutes to crawl there. The dogs, sensing danger, circled him wildly. Ragnar nudged Silas's shoulder with his wet nose, urging him up. Onyx prowled back and forth, scanning the surroundings like he was hunting an unseen sniper who'd struck down their leader. Luminina quietly walked beside him, brushing her side against his arm, a quiet, steady anchor. "I'm okay," Silas gasped, lying to them all. But he wasn't. By the time he dragged himself into the bedroom and pulled his battered body onto the mattress, the pain had unleashed a full-blown systemic shock. His worn frame already drained from heat, and hard labor spiraled out of control. The inflammation surged. His fever soared. No phone was within reach in that room. The only landline sat a mile away across a floor that felt like jagged shards of broken glass. "Just rest," he muttered, closing his eyes. Just 1 hour. Just one. That hour bled into a day. The day dissolved into a nightmare. The fever dragged him into the shadows of memories he'd fought 5 years to escape. The cabin faded away. The ceiling fan transformed into the steady blades of a Black Hawk helicopter, pounding rhythmically through the thick, humid air. The scent of pine and worn timber gave way to the acrid, biting smell of burning rubber and metallic blood. Silas thrashed beneath soaked sheets burning up in a delirious haze. "Viper 2, check in," he rasped, voice breaking in the hollow room. "Miller Doc, where's the evac?" Silence answered him, save for the heavy, ragged pound of his own breath. In his mind, he sank back into the desert sand, pressing down on a wound that wouldn't quit bleeding. But this time it wasn't a dog beside him. It was Miller, his spotter. Miller's eyes pleaded thirsty. Silas reached for his canteen. It was dry. "I'm sorry," Silas whimpered, twisting in sweat-drenched sheets. "I'm dry, Miller. Dry as bone." Thirst gnawed at him with cruel claws, his throat feeling lined with sandpaper. He struggled to wake, to rise, to find water. But the searing agony in his back pinned him like a slab of stone to the earth. He slipped in and out of consciousness, losing hold of the sun's passage. The dogs grew restless and confused. For the first day, they prowled the house endlessly. Their bowls stood empty. The back door remained locked. The routine, the sacred order Silas had drilled into their bones, had shattered. Usually a bored, hungry German shepherd is pure chaos. A 6-month-old pack left alone for 48 hours should have shredded the sofa to scraps, raided every pantry. A 6-month-old litter left alone for 2 full days would have shredded the couch to pieces, ravaged the kitchen cupboards. The curtains lay torn and shredded, yet the cabin's air was far from dull. It was charged with urgency. Animals sense the scent of illness. It alters the very pheromones a person emits. They caught the sharp, bitter sting of fevered sweat, the chemical cry of suffering. Ragnar, the fierce warrior who once faced down a bear, took the first watch. He left his cherished spot on the rug and stationed himself in the bedroom doorway. There he lay, staring down the hallway, massive paws crossed. Sleep eluded him. His ears pivoted at every creak as the cabin settled into the night. He was the sentinel. With the alpha bedridden, the beta stood guard. Nothing, not a spirit, not a shadow, would breach that door. Lumina, the resourceful corpsman, grew anxious over their dwindling supplies. On the second afternoon, Silas stirred from his stupor, coughing harshly. "Water," he rasped. Lumina hurried to the bathroom. The toilet lid was down. She moved toward the kitchen. The sink towered too high. Searching instead, she found a water bowl in the corner, just holding a shallow pool of tepid water. She drank deeply. Turning back to the bedroom, she leapt onto the bed, an outright violation of their rules, one that typically earned a sharp off command, but none came. She crept close to Silas's face, lowering herself to tenderly lick his cheek, her tongue moist and gentle. Silas flinched, twisting away slightly, but the moisture lingered. It wasn't a full cup of water, but it was something vital. She repeated the gesture softly, transferring precious hydration from her mouth to his cracked skin, whining with quiet concern. Resting her head beside his on the pillow, she watched his eyelids flutter. The third night tested them all. The fever broke, but it fought back fiercely. Silas jolted awake, gasping. His heart pounded wildly, erratically, hammering against his ribs, a cruel panic born of excruciating pain and confusion. Breaths came short and sharp. The walls seemed to close around him, suffocating, unforgiving. Gasping for air, he was caught in a maelstrom of shallow spasms. "I'm dying," he thought. "This is it. My heart is giving out." From the darkness, a shadow stirred. Onyx. The black dog had been curled at the foot of the bed, alert to the shift in Silas's breathing, tuned to the sudden gasp, the unmistakable scent of rising terror. Onyx did not bark or lick. He acted on a primal instinct, a deep-rooted command seeded in the DNA of working dogs for generations. He climbed the mattress. Rather than lying beside Silas, he mounted him. Silas groaned beneath the crushing weight of the 60-pound dog. Off he gasped weakly. Can't breathe. Yet Onyx held firm. Flattened against him, the dog spread his weight evenly from collarbone to diaphragm. He pressed down a natural form of deep pressure therapy neither man nor beast fully understood. It was a trigger for survival, a reset for the body. The firm weight forced Silas to pull air in more deliberately. His breath slowed, controlled mechanically. The pressure activated the vagus nerve, signaling his parasympathetic nervous system to ease. Onyx nestled his heavy head against Silas's shoulder, mere inches from his ear, and exhaled slowly, deliberately. Whoosh! Trapped beneath the dog's weight, Silas had no choice but to mirror the steady rhythm. He breathed in, resisting the gentle pressure of Onyx's ribs. He exhaled in time with the dog. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Gradually, the frantic pounding of his heart began to ebb. The walls stopped closing in. The desert's cruel hallucinations faded, replaced by the firm, steadfast presence. The grounding reality of fur and muscle wrapped Silas in its steadfast embrace as he clasped the black dog's neck, burying his face deep within the coarse coat. The wave of panic ebbed away, replaced by an overwhelming fatigue and an unexpected, profound calm. Silas awoke on the dawn of the fourth day. Sunlight poured indifferently through the window, bathing the room in a harsh glow. The fever had broken, leaving him fragile and hollowed, yet his mind was clear. The relentless back pain had softened into a manageable ache. Blinking, he tried to piece together his surroundings. The bed felt crowded. Onyx remained asleep, stretched across his legs like a heavy black anchor. Lumina curled tightly against his stomach, her head cradled on his hip. On the floor, Ragnar rested his chin on the mattress, his eyes locked onto Silas with a gaze so intense it felt almost human. The room smelled foul, thick with sweat sickness and the musk of unwashed dogs. A mess likely awaited him in the hallway, demanding cleanup. Parched, famished, and aching, he was alive. Silas struggled to sit up, stirring the pack awake. Onyx stretched and yawned. Lumina's tail began a slow, steady thump against the sheets. Ragnar rose and nudged Silas's hand. Silas met their eyes. He glanced at the empty water bowl that Lumina had dragged into the room at some point. His gaze drifted to the door Ragnar had guarded. The weight pressing down on his chest, pulling him back from the brink of panic, came rushing back. For 3 days he lay helpless. The provider, the alpha, the guardian, he had fallen, but the order had not crumbled. Instead, it had reversed. They hadn't eaten, they hadn't been let outside, they hadn't panicked. They simply stood watch. You guys, Silas croaked, his voice dry and frail. You held the line. He reached out, running a hand over Onyx's head, scratching behind Lumina's ears, then cupping Ragnar's jaw. I thought I was saving you, Silas whispered, finally grasping the truth that had grown since the blizzard struck. I thought I was the rescuer. He swung his legs over the bed's edge. Pain flared, but motion was possible. With trembling legs and a pale face, he stood. The dogs closed in around him, their bodies offering steady support, leaning in to keep him upright. All right, Team Silas said, a small, genuine smile breaking through his beard. Mission complete. Stand down. He limped towards the kitchen, 3 shadows moving in perfect harmony with every one of his steps. They weren't just healed, they were healers. And Silas Vance, the man who sought only solitude and decay, finally understood that solitude was no longer his fate. He would never walk alone again. October unfolded across the great Smoky Mountains, like a spilled cauldron of molten gold and copper. The thick, green canopy that had shielded Silas Vance's cabin throughout summer surrendered to the frost, bursting into a